Chapter 18. Adeena poured herself a glass of wine and stood in the kitchen of her condo, looking out over the Ottawa River that kept Quebec from sliding into Ontario. She noticed there were 2 missed calls from Philip on her phone, and also a text message from him. "Dinner? I'm leaving in the morning. Let me spoil you." She swiped the message back and forth on her phone, as if she was toying with his offer. The glass of chilled Pinot was calling to her, and she sipped it thoughtfully, unable to form a response to the simple text message. Who am I kidding? Adeena was trying to think of a reason why she couldn't have dinner with him, and yet there really wasn't anything she could come up with. "Gee, Philip, I know you love me. My parents think you're amazing. You have a great family, a good job. You want kids. You love adventure, traveling, and making love to me. But..." She poured a little more wine into her glass. "But I'd rather black out and dream that I'm another woman from the past with another man no one else will ever meet." Adeena took her phone and typed a response. "Okay, where?" While she waited for a reply, she got up and walked towards her bedroom, thinking about what she should wear tonight. The Duncan cello sat in the corner, still in the special double-line traveling case she used to transport it. She felt an almost magnetic attraction tugging at her as she tried to walk by it. She wanted to ignore it. Friedrich Lang knew she had taken the precious instrument. How long before Tara figured it out? And now Walter knew her secret too. She thought about him and Maria, and about Walter's wife Grace and their 2 kids, both about Adeena's age. They had grown up together. Grace had even been something of an aunt to her. Walter worshipped his wife, but Maria had a passion that must have been hard for him to resist, especially when they were alone for long stretches out of the country, making music together. Adeena didn't like what Walter had done, but she understood the emotions that drew musicians together. Adeena touched the rough surface of the Bam cello flight case. A spike of adrenaline shot through her. It was becoming a forbidden pleasure. It felt like it was calling to her. Taking the Duncan cello had been wrong on every front, and there was no way to justify it. She realized that she could be arrested and maybe even serve time for what she had done. She might find a way to spin some kind of story about having restorative work done on it, creating a prop for security purposes, or some other lame excuse. But deep down, she knew she had to make things right. Even though she struggled against it, she kept her hand on the cello case, unable to escape its pull. A few inches away lay the doorway to another world, one that was beginning to feel more where she belonged than her own reality. Catherine's cello and her music were expensive artifacts, intriguing historical curiosities for galleries and museums. The Duncan cello might be worth millions to a collector, and the music might be the ticket to jumpstart a frustrated old composer's career. But no one understood their true value. Adeena finally found the strength to lift her hand. She knew the cello and the music were worth fighting for, and that somehow they played a part in the story of her family, her grandmother, her father, and herself. If she had to be incarcerated to sort things out, well, she just might have to do that. Her phone beeped and vibrated on the counter. It was probably Philip texting her back. Before she could answer it, there was a knock on the door. Adeena looked over, confused. She went to the door and opened it wide. Philip stood in the hallway, smiling. He was dressed in a dark suit and purple tie. "Surprise!" Adeena laughed. "You don't give a girl a chance, do you? Come on in. I got reservations for a new place on the market. It just opened," he said as he walked into her apartment. "Gourmet pasta, fresh seafood flown in every day, all with French wines paired with each course. The chef is from Le Cordon Bleu. He just arrived from Europe." "That sounds good," she said. "I'm starving. Just give me a minute to put something on." She gave Philip a peck on the cheek and turned towards her room. "Pour yourself some wine." Philip watched Adeena as she turned and started towards her room. Just as she approached her bedroom door, he called out to her. "What's that?" She stopped by the Bam cello flight case. "You mean this?" she said, pointing to the oversized black case. Philip looked at her seriously. "That's not your case." His smile was gone. "I hope it's not what I think it is," he said sternly. Adeena hesitated. Had there been a news release? Did everyone know she had the Duncan cello? I needed to have Guy Harrison do some touch-ups on it, she said weakly. Trying to fool Philip was like trying to swim across Wolf Lake in lead boots. Adeena, do you have any idea what you're doing? He asked. Friedrich Lang told me you took the Duncan cello, but I didn't believe him. I thought he was just trying to threaten me, that he was an old fool. Oh my God, Adeena, he groaned. She turned and walked back towards him. She took his hand and held it in hers, looking up into his face. Can I at least try and explain this to you? For the next 15 minutes, Adeena told Philip one more time everything about her experience with the Duncan cello, and what happened when she played the lost score that her grandmother had sent to her. He listened as she described her performance and how she became Catherine Carnegie, the composer, singer, and cellist. She told him how Robert Duncan had designed the cello for Catherine, and that she had 2 brothers, George and Sir James Carnegie, the captain, and how they ended up on opposite sides of the 1745 uprising in Scotland. Philip studied her curiously. He said very little during her explanation. When she finished, he moved over and sat down on the sofa. He put his head back and stared at the ceiling. He looked lost in thought as he rubbed his temples and shook his head in frustration. "Oh my," he said at last. "I can't believe this is happening." "What's that supposed to mean?" Adeena asked. You, Adeena. You steal the cello, and now you tell me I don't know what you're trying to say. You're time traveling?" He gazed out the condo windows toward the dark sky. "You don't believe a word I've said, do you?" she replied. "Adeena, come on," he sang out, exasperated. "You're not really going back in time. You know your history, you know the music. You are just dreaming all this stuff. Do you not understand? None of this, all these stories you've told me, none of this is real." "You think I'm crazy," Adeena replied. "Don't you?" "I didn't say you were crazy. But do you not think that maybe it's just all happening in your mind?" he said, standing up and straightening his tie. "Let's go talk about it over some wine. We'll have dinner and we can sort this out." Adeena looked at him like he had just murdered her dog. "Philip," she said, putting her thoughts together, "you have no idea what I'm going through. You're right. I may be going crazy, or this might really be happening to me. Either way, I need you. I need you to be really with me on this." Philip was silent. He seemed to be reviewing his options. "Okay, I'll try. Are we going?" "I need to know. Do you believe me or not?" she said, her laser eyes boring a hole through his skull. He hesitated a long while before he answered tentatively, in a barely audible whisper. "I don't think I can, Adeena. I just can't believe that could really be happening." She felt herself losing control. An inner tension grew from tiny pebble to blazing comet in a nanosecond. Why couldn't he just be there for her when she needed him most? If he could not or would not, she wanted him gone. "I don't want you here. Please leave me alone." "Adeena, you need help. Let me take you somewhere, take you to see someone. But first, let me take the Duncan cello back to the gallery before you get arrested." "No! Just leave! Leave me alone! I'm crazy, right? Your fucking wacko criminal girlfriend!" she screamed. "Right?" "Adeena, please, leave!" He hesitated for a moment, and then took a few steps towards the door. He stopped for a second, looked at her, shook his head, and walked out the door. Adeena sobbed as she opened the Bamcello case. Philip was probably right. She needed help, and none of this was real. Yes, she knew the history, and she knew the music. As she lifted the Duncan cello from the confines of its inner case, she felt like she was losing control. Catherine was becoming stronger, and Adeena weaker. She needed the oxygen that only the Duncancello and the lost score could provide. Her eyes filled with tears as she began to play, a junkie, unable to resist her next fix. Lady Jeanne stood before Adeena, holding a steaming pot with the same blue inlaid flowers and leaves as the cup Adeena held in her hand. "Catherine, more tea, dear?" Adeena looked up at her and nodded. "Yes, please." She was seated at a wide oak table with bright sunlight streaming through the long, narrow windows that provided a view of the spectacular ornamental gardens in the castle's courtyards. Around the table sat Catherine's brother George and James Drummond. Both ate heartily of the breakfast laid before them: thick hocks of ham and roasted pork, hard-boiled eggs, toast, oatmeal cakes, marmalade, and what looked like a pint of dark ale parked in front of each of their overflowing plates. "Eat hearty, aye. The road could be with the both of ye a long time," Lady Jeanne admonished, and then turned to George. "Ye have chosen wisely. Your brother the captain not so well." George smiled at her analysis as he finished his breakfast. "His mind was made up years ago," George said, finishing off a thick piece of ham. "As a child, it would seem. The history he learned in Glasgow was twisted to paint a glorious picture of a union ripe with riches and opportunity. They neglected to tell him that his family fought and died for over 200 years to preserve Scotland." "Aye," Lady Jeanne said. "Your aunt, the Countess Lady Margaret, tried everything to give your brother a proper education by those who know the history of the Carnegie family. Your brother became chief of the House of Sussex when your father died, but alas, he never learned its history. Instead, he developed a hatred for the Jacobites who seek to preserve it." James listened to all this without saying a word. He finished up his breakfast and drank deeply from the tankard of ale before him. He wiped his lips with a linen cloth, laid the empty pewter vessel on the table. "Today we start for Edinburgh. The capital will soon be restored," he said. Lady Jeanne beamed at his confidence. "Your father and your grandfather, the whole Drummond and Gordon clans, in fact, will be watching. They are counting on you, James," she warned. "You must not fail them." James nodded. "We will do them proud before the week is nigh. I found another 150 men from Perthshire to march with us, along with more than 2,000 who have already joined us. And now we have the support of the Farquharsons, the MacGregors, Stuarts, Menzies, and the Robertsons. They all pledged their allegiance to the prince last night." He paused, glancing at Adeena. "After the ball." Adeena watched the back and forth between James and his mother. As Lady Jeanne continued to talk, explaining to George how she had been praying for this day since her husband had died 25 years ago, James caught Adeena's eye. He seemed to be pointing his head slightly to the right, as if he wanted her to follow him. Lady Jeanne sat down beside George, took his arm, and began explaining how her husband had been part of the Jacobite group that had almost captured Edinburgh Castle during the 1715 rising some 30 years before. Adeena stood up. "Excuse me for a moment," she said. George and Lady Jeanne barely heard her as she left the table. James was not far behind. Outside of Drummond Castle, Adeena saw men preparing for the march. They had amassed supplies of oatmeal, cured beef, salted herring, and salmon, along with barrels of brandy and ale, and were loading them onto wagons that would follow behind the men on their trek towards Edinburgh. The brindle stallion, Belgair, was tied to a post, and she smiled at the sight of him. He glanced over at her and snorted loudly, raising his head high in the air. "Now you be careful what you say to her, Belgair," James laughed as he drew up and stood beside her. Adeena chuckled. "Don't worry, he only says nice things to me." James gave the horse's nose a good rub. "Catherine, I may be gone for some time, and I want you to know that I will watch over George. I will do my best to protect him." "Thank you, James," Adeena said. She moved closer and scratched the side of Belgair's sturdy neck. He seemed to appreciate it and stamped his front hoof. She glanced at James. "Your mother puts a lot of pressure on you, doesn't she?" He smiled. "Your brother the captain may be fierce in battle, and General Cope may have cannon and fodder aimed at my head, but it is my own mother who truly gives me a fright. Adeena laughed. I can see that. I guess you grew up hearing all about your duty and finishing the work of your father. I did, my lady, he replied, from the age of 7. That is when he died and I became head of the family and took his title, Duke of Perth. I've known my responsibility and my duty to all those who came before me for a very long time indeed. Is that why you fight now? Why you are leaving for Edinburgh? She asked. James looked at her with some confusion. He seemed to be thinking, uncertain how best to reply. Catherine, you have given me a renewed spirit to believe that what I do is necessary, and indeed required, to help restore the kingdom, the lost kingdom of my father, and his father, and all the members of the House Drummond before me, he replied. He paused a moment, looking at her. But Catherine, you probe deeply. You seek to understand me, do you not? Adeena studied him. His blue eyes, long hair, and soft features belied the savage strength she had seen him display when he saved her in the forest. I guess I do, James, she replied. I want to know what drives you to take up this fight. He looked away. Maybe this was not the way a woman in the 18th century talked to a man. That is a question which I often ponder myself, he said finally after a long pause, and one which no one, save Rosalind, has ever asked me before. Rosalind? My first love in France, he replied. We spent the summer together when I was a boy of 10 and 8 years. 18? Yes, I met her as a boy. I left as a man. What happened to her? She was a widow, older than me, and... His words trailed off. He turned and looked at Adeena. My mother, my brother John and I, we all needed to return home from France to Scotland, back to Drummond Castle where I was born. I had been away for more than 10 years. I was like a stranger when I returned to this place, but alas, the land was deeper inside of me than I ever imagined. Adeena wasn't sure what he was trying to say. What about Rosalind? I mean, what happened to her? James's face tightened. The fever. It took her not long after I left Paris. Our letters were few, but they live sacred in my memory. After she was gone, I took to running Drummond and worked more than 10 years on a plan for the township of Crieff with everything I had learned in France. For her? Adeena asked. She was never far from my thoughts, he replied. He took his hand and laid it on her shoulder. His touch was strong and firm. I have nae talked this way before, not since I was with her. She reached for his face and stroked his cheek. James, you're a good man. I think I'm beginning to know your heart. He drew her into his arms and pulled her closer. You do, Catherine, because you are there. She closed her eyes as they held each other. The world of past and present collided in her head. Whether this was real or a dream she could not tell, but all she could feel now was James. She felt like she could hold him a long time. Catherine, we need to be on our way. Release your prisoner. The voice came from George, who now approached them. She smiled as James relaxed his hold on her. Yes, my laird, she replied. As you command. James let her go and moved towards Balgare, checking the fittings on his bridle and saddle. She noticed another horse, a brown mare, being trotted towards them by a soldier dressed in the red colours of the Perth regiment. Catherine, I want you to stay here with Lady Jeanne until you receive word from me, George told her. We are meeting the Prince at Drummond Castle and then plotting our route to Edinburgh. Drummond Castle? She asked. Yes, the House of Scone, James interrupted, stepping forward, holding Balgare's reins. The prince's father, King James VIII, stayed there almost 30 years ago. It is where all our kings have been crowned for the last 500 years. George kissed his sister on the cheek. I will send word soon, he said. Stay here until you hear from me. I will, she said. Be safe, George. Take care of yourself. He nodded and walked towards the brown mare. James stood before her. I want to carry something from you into battle with me, he said. From me? Adeena asked, confused. Just your words. The ones that live within me, he said. He held a sheaf of paper that he had extracted from his saddlebag. Give me your mark, Catherine, that I may keep it always close. He handed the paper to her, and a quill that he used for his daily journal. Adeena took them and bent over the wooden table that sat beside her. She thought for a moment. "Forever I will wait for you." She looked at it and then over at James, now saddled on Belgair. He wanted her mark. She bent over and hesitated, and then signed the note. She looked down at what she had written, Catherine. Adeena took the paper and handed it to him. He read it slowly, closed his eyes for a long moment, and then bowed his head to her. He folded the note, placed it inside his uniform, and turned the reins of his horse towards the road. As she watched him ride away, the morning sun filled her eyes with a brightness that overwhelmed her. She wondered how long it would be until she saw him again. The sun grew brighter still, until she felt it completely absorb her. Philip wandered through the Byward Market in a state of confusion. He was not used to this feeling. He was usually in control. As a reporter, it was usually he with inside knowledge, or a strong hunch to follow, a puzzle he could solve by following clues, like a scavenger hunt that eventually led to his journalistic prize. But as he slowly wandered by the clubs and restaurants of the market, still dressed in his new black shoes, dark suit, and purple tie, he felt hopelessly lost. Adeena had told him she needed him to really be with her, and yet she had kicked him out of her apartment for the first time in their relationship, and instead of being there to help her, here he was parading around in his silly outfit, dressed up like a monkey with nowhere to go. Adeena was the woman he loved, even if he couldn't always understand her. He stopped and looked back over his shoulder at the light from her 14th floor condominium window. "I need you to really be with me." Her words rang in his ears. He wondered what true love looks like in this situation. Does he go and get her help? Does he just listen? Or does he work hard to believe what she was trying to explain, even if it was completely impossible? Maybe I just need to give her time and space. Philip stood thinking for a moment, watching cars flash by and couples holding hands walking down the street together, looking happy just being with each other. Finally, he turned around and started back for Adeena's condo. Whatever he should be doing, he knew it didn't involve turning his back on her now. The sun was still blinding Adeena's eyes with an impossible brightness. As she tried to shield her eyes, she noticed shadowy figures standing nearby, staring at her. "Adeena?" spoke one of the figures. "Belle?" The figure came closer. It was her mother. "Mom?" she replied. "Where am I?" "In the hospital, at the Civic," her mother responded softly. She closed the blinds a bit to help shade the bright sunlight streaming into the room. "How are you feeling?" Adeena sat up and looked around. She was in a hospital room. One half of the wall beside her was made up of large windows looking out over Carling Avenue and the open fields of the Central Experimental Farm across the street. Her mother stood beside the bed, a nurse by her side. "I'm okay," Adeena finally replied. "What happened?" Her mother sat down on the edge of the bed and took her hand. "Philip called me last night," she said. "He was in a bit of a panic. He told me you blacked out, and so we called an ambulance and brought you to Emerge here. You were so groggy we couldn't wake you up." Adeena felt strange listening to this story. It seemed less real to her than traveling back in time, though much more probable to just about everyone else. "Is Philip here too?" "Yes, Belle," her mother replied. "He just went to get a coffee. He's been here with you all night." Adeena wondered what he was thinking about all this. Jackie put her hand on Adeena's forehead. "I called Tara, too. She wants to come and see you." Adeena closed her eyes. "What have I done to all these people who believe in me?" The nurse stepped forward, a sturdy-looking middle-aged woman with a shock of short blonde hair and a blue butterfly tattoo on her neck. "Do you think you can stand up for me?" she asked gently. Adeena wasn't sure about that, just like everything else in her life. "I don't know," she replied, pulling off the sheet that covered her. She was wearing a thin hospital gown. The last time she had worn this outfit was in high school when she ended up in the trauma unit after an overdose. For 2 days she went in and out of touch with the conscious world after coming down from a mix of alcohol, LSD, cocaine, and God knows what else she had taken at the after-prom party. Her bare feet touched the cold tile floor, and though she felt a bit wobbly, the nurse was pleased that she stood up without assistance. "That's good," she said, locking her arm around Adeena's to make sure she didn't fall over. "Mum, she's going to need to walk. We have to get her moving." Her mother stepped forward. "Of course I can take her." "Thanks," the nurse said, looking down at her charts. She read them over for a few seconds. "Oh, wait, before you do, Dr. Lochiel has ordered an MRI, and I need to ask Adeena a few screening questions." "Oh, sure," Adeena responded. "Do you weigh more than 200 kilograms?" The nurse laughed. "Forget that one." Next question. Is there a possibility you may be pregnant?" Jackie smiled and folded her hands together and raised her eyes, as if praying for an affirmative response. "No, I'm pretty sure I'm not, but—" Adeena hesitated. "But what?" her mother interfected. "Well, I haven't had a period since—" Adeena looked at her wrist as if she were wearing a watch. "I guess technically I just missed one, but it feels like it's been a long time for some reason. And I've had some really wicked cramps lately." The nurse made a note on her chart. "Really? I'll let the doctor know. We're doing some blood work first, and we'll find out for sure, one way or the other." William had spent most of the morning taking the tour of the ornamental gardens at Drummond Castle near Perth. He was amazed at the complexity and design of the gardens, but his real interest lay inside. He was disappointed to learn that the castle was not open to the public. However, he found out from the guide giving the tour that Drummond Castle was an important landmark in the Scottish Lowlands, and that James Drummond, 3rd Duke of Perth, was a prominent character in its long, illustrious history. After the tour, William approached the guide, a wise-cracking retired teacher who had taught both history and geography in secondary schools in Scotland. The man, Daniel, had thick bushy eyebrows and an even thicker mustache that set on his long, stern face. He wore a bonnet that topped his ceremonial kilt and jacket. At 6.5 feet tall, he made a very imposing impression. The two men hit it off at once, with their shared passion for history and interest in understanding the origins of things around them. Little details most just took for granted. "During the 1745 Rising," William asked him, "who was in charge here?" "The castle, you mean?" Daniel asked. "Yes. I know that James Drummond fought in the war, and was a lieutenant general with Bonnie Prince Charles, as was his brother John," William said. "Their mother, Lady Jeanne, did she manage the castle during the Rising?" Daniel looked at William closely for a second. "Impressive, laddie. You've nae missed a thing, have ye?" "I've just started doing some reading. I'm interested in the Jacobite Risings, and I've been looking for a new research project for my graduate students," William explained, thinking that this was going to be his focus for some time to come. "Then ye know that Lady Jeanne was sent to Edinburgh and locked up for a long time, and that she outlived both her sons." William hadn't time to fully research James Drummond yet. "Oh, interesting. And when did the Duke of Perth die?" "James was a brave lad. He was greatly influenced by those around him. He was brilliant, naturally gifted, and would have changed the world had he not died after Culloden." Daniel mused. "Tried to hold up the family honour, be a good Catholic, please his mother and all his relations. Pleased everyone, it seems, except himself, perhaps." "How did he die?" "At sea, in the Channel on a French frigate. Maybe a few weeks after the slaughter on the moors of Culloden House," Daniel explained. "He was wounded in battle, leading his men to the end. They had nae hope in hell, and he probably knew it too. Still, he was at the front of the charge, commanding the left wing against the Redcoats." William sat silent. He had heard about the Battle of Culloden, but it had never seemed so personal before. Daniel pointed to a statue. "He was buried at sea, but there's a plaque over there if you want to see for yourself." William stared at the inscription on the longsword that served as a tribute to the man. James Drummond, 3rd Duke of Perth, born 11 May 1713, died 13 May 1746. Poor as I am, I would rather than £1,000 that my colours are safe. "He never married?" "No, sir, not our poor James," Daniel replied. "I'm afraid duty and honour were his mistress. His mother made sure o' that." "And so he died without issue?" No children? William said, still staring at the sword. Indeed, that line of Drummond ended with him. Daniel replied, shaking his head.